And here we go. Oh, all right. Hi, this is Metta Spencer, and I'm in Toronto. And Happy New Year. We have a tribe of my friends here who are all ready to talk about the risks of radioactivity. And all of them are experts on this topic. And I have to tell you, it's not a balanced set of opinions that we're sharing here. We've got all pretty much unanimous attitude, I think, toward the risks of radiation or radioactivity. So let me introduce our panelists. I'm going to start with Angela. This is Angela Bischoff, who is the, I don't know whether you're a director or whatever, but you're with the Ontario Clean Air Alliance, right?
Thank you.
Yeah. And then we have Dr. Richard Denton, who is, I guess you're in Sudbury, aren't you, Richard?
Right.
And Richard is an associate professor at the Northern Ontario School of Medicine. And he has been the president of CAPE, the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, and Physicians for Global Survival, which has to do mainly with nuclear weapons, concerns about those things. And he is, in fact, the North American co-chair for International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. I copied this all down from someplace, so it's a little longer. You get a longer introduction, I guess, than Gordon Edwards, who is merely the president of the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility for the last 20 or 30 or 40 years, right? Gordon?
Yeah.
Gordon is speaking to us from his home, I guess, in Montreal. And he is absolutely the leading authority, depending on which point of view you are listening to. And I listen to people who tend to think that he knows more about nuclear power than anybody, and the effects of nuclear radiation and stuff, than anybody else in Canada. So you guys are all controversial, and I have my own perspective, but we're not going to have a whole lot of disagreement among ourselves, I think. Because I believe today we're not really specifically talking about nuclear weapons, although we talk about that a lot on this talk show. But I think we need to talk more about, once in a while, about the physiology of exposure to radiation and the environmental contaminants that surround us, and the way we have made our lives riskier by having these in our environment, especially by things like nuclear power plants. So, having disclosed my own sympathies, I will ask, maybe Richard Denton will be so kind as to give us a short kind of overview of the nuclear fuel chain. Where does this stuff come from, and how does it get turned into the dangerous material that's around us, and what becomes of it, and what are the problems of handling it along the way? Richard, give us an overview.
Okay, I'm a medical doctor, and so that's basically my point of view, is looking at it from the effects of radiation on the human body. There's two types of radiation: non-ionizing, which is electromagnetic radiation, which is your Wi-Fi, cell phones, that sort of thing. And non-ionizing is unable to break down a molecule and is therefore described as weak radiation. It still can certainly do damage, but I'm going to speak today about ionizing radiation, which is more powerful radiation that can break a molecule in part. There are several types of radiation, what we term as alpha, beta, gamma, and X-ray. Again, alpha is, some people will say it's a weak type of radiation because it's a particle. It's 2 protons, 2 neutrons, namely a helium nucleus. And it can be stopped with a piece of paper. It can be stopped. It doesn't go very far. And so a lot of people feel that alpha radiation is um, fairly safe. But I would like to counter that and say that when you inhale it as a gas from radon, which is ubiquitous about us, it's a heavier than air gas, so it's found in basements, also in mines, and is now declared an occupational disease for miners because it, when it gets into the lungs, it can cause cancer. Radon gas is now the #2 cause of lung cancer in Canada. And so even though it can be stopped by a piece of paper, it is still very dangerous when it gets into your body. The other types, beta, gamma, and X-rays are much more powerful. Beta can be stopped by wood and plastic. Gamma will go right through you, as will X-rays. And again, they're much more powerful and can do other types of damage. A couple other points I just want to point out is susceptibility. Children, fetuses in particular, the newborn children and women are much more susceptible to radiation. So I think this is a point that I want to make. Another point that I want to make is the difference between acute and chronic exposure. So acute exposure would be an atomic blast. It would be a nuclear power station meltdown like Chernobyl or Fukushima, where you have a tremendous amount of radiation released at one specific time, and that can give radiation sickness, depending on the dose, death. But it affects rapidly dividing cells, so you'll get upset stomach, diarrhea, nausea and vomiting. You'll get hair loss, because your hair is rapidly growing. It will affect the skin, and then it can affect other organs as well. But it's basically an acute situation. And whereas a lot of people will dismiss chronic low dose radiation, and that type of radiation is what gets into your lungs, what I talked about with radon gas causing lung cancer after maybe 20 years. It can cause leukemia in children who are around nuclear power plants. And it can affect various glands, the thyroid, and cause thyroid cancer. So these are two aspects that also need to be considered. I think one of the problems that when we speak about radiation and get into nuclear weapons is that people think that nuclear weapons are just a big bomb, obviously much more powerful, a lot more destructive. But you have films such as, say, Independence Day, which showed the destruction of Washington, and then the heroes climb out of the rubble and save the day. But if that was an atomic bomb, radiation would have affected them, destroyed their blood, caused anemia, caused all these other things that I have mentioned. So, and also the thing is that radiation travels around the world. So years ago, when the various big five countries, namely the US, Russia, China, India, Great Britain, and France, were testing their weapons, we got a lot of radiation throughout the world. And one of the products was Strontium-90. And here,
excuse me, Richard, this was, how did this happen? Was it up in the stratosphere and the circulation of the gases around the atmosphere is what disperse these particles?
Correct. Yeah.
I'd just like to put in a little note here, is that properly speaking, one wouldn't say the radiation spreads, it's the radioactivity which spreads, the radioactive materials. It's important to realize that there are hundreds and even thousands of radioactive materials which are human-made and are created at the moment of a blast or during the operation of a nuclear reactor. And it's those materials which emit the radiation that Dr. Denton is talking about. So that these materials are basically carriers. They're sort of like microscopic X-ray machines that can go inside you and irradiate you from inside, and some of them also irradiate you from the outside because they give off this penetrating gamma radiation that Dr. Denton was talking about earlier. So it's the materials that spread.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Edwards, for that correction and elaboration. And I just want to point out that it was our own Canadian, Dr. Ursula Franklin, who became the Canadian tooth fairy and pointed out the effects of strontium-90 in babies' teeth. So I think that is another concept that a lot of people forget about. Now, I just want to talk about the nuclear fuel chain specifically.
If I could just say a word about strontium-90 in particular, because this is an interesting example. Strontium is not a man-made substance. It's a naturally occurring material. It's a naturally occurring element, but it's not radioactive in nature. It's when nuclear bombs and nuclear reactors create a radioactive version of strontium, and that's called strontium-90. So it doesn't exist in nature at all. Strontium is in nature, but strontium-90 is totally human-made. So anytime you find strontium-90, you know that it was made by a bomb blast or by a nuclear reactor. It can't just be there by natural causes. And this material goes into the bones of children and teeth and skeleton, just like natural strontium does. The difference being that the atoms are exploding and giving off this radiation, which causes accelerated damage way and above anything that the chemistry would cause.
Mm-hmm.
And I would just add again that when you look at uranium, I sort of think of it as very simplistically as a doctor, is that it's a big molecule. When it breaks in half, what we call fission, you are left with new elements such as strontium, cesium, iodine.
Radioactive versions of those things.
Correct. Mm-hmm. And thanks again, Dr. Edwards. And these then are taken up in the body. And so cesium is like calcium. It's taken up in the bone, as is strontium. And again, you can go to your periodic table and find similarities between the various elements. But these are taken up by the body. And so iodine goes specifically to the thyroid gland. And that's where it then causes the cancers and the leukemias and the other problems that medically we face.
I have another question here, and that is that I've heard that, there's a prophylactic. They have certain kinds of pills. I think it's to protect people from damage to their thyroid. If, for example, there were an explosion at one of our reactors and we had to try to protect as many people in Toronto as possible, I think there's a place where you can get certain kind of pills. Now, I don't know what those pills are and what they are designed to protect us from.
Perhaps I could explain that. You see, once again, iodine is natural and non-radioactive. Radioactive iodine is not found in nature. It's only human-made stuff, and that comes from the nuclear fission, the splitting of uranium atoms. Otherwise, it's not there. Now, when iodine, normal iodine, non-radioactive iodine, goes to the thyroid, which is where it goes in the body, it performs a valuable function. It actually helps the thyroid resist a disease called goiter. And in fact, if you go to your salt shaker, you'll find it's iodized salt. It means they've added iodine to it. It's actually preventative medicine to help you from not getting this disease called goiter, which is not life-threatening, but which is very disfiguring. Now, radioactive iodine is like a twin of non-radioactive iodine. It also goes to the thyroid. It also helps to prevent goiter, but because it's radioactive, it kicks the hell out of the thyroid gland by breaking molecules and precipitating unstable remnants of molecules, which can then develop into cancers. And what's more, it can cause a lot of other diseases related to thyroid malfunction, such as in young children, it can cause stunted growth and even mental retardation. It can cause, and that's because of the radioactive material being unstable. So here's the problem with radioactivity, is that in nature we do have radioactive materials, but they're mostly at the heavy end of the table, as Dr. Denton was mentioning earlier. What happens with bombs and with nuclear reactors is we create hundreds of, you might say, clones of non-radioactive materials, which are radioactive. Once those new radioactive materials, human-made, never existing in nature before 1939, once they're mixed into our environment, they'll be there forever, for as long as the radioactivity lasts. And in many cases, that's centuries or even millennia. So this is the real problem, is that we're contaminating non-radioactive material with radioactive varieties that are human-made.
Well, is there anything, it's presumably then iodine pills.
Yeah, I can explain that. The reason for iodine pills is simply this, that the thyroid can only take so much iodine. And if you give it non-radioactive iodine, a plenty, then it will resist any more iodine. It'll say, look, I've had enough iodine, don't give me any more. And therefore, it'll reject the radioactive iodine. So the reason for the iodine pills is simply to saturate the thyroid gland with non-radioactive stuff before the radioactive material comes along. But you got to do it beforehand. You can't do it afterwards. It's not a morning after pill. You got to do it before the radioactive iodine appears. So if the authorities don't tell you there's been an accident, you don't know there's radioactive iodine in the air or in the food or in the milk, then you're helpless, because the pill, you don't know enough to take the pills.
Well, could they give strontium pills out too, or other chemicals that are not radioactive as a preventive measure?
They don't have them.
Would it be a good idea if they did have them?
Nobody has really developed such pills, and nobody has even suggested it. I think the problem is that there are, as I said, literally hundreds of varieties. And if you wanted to protect yourself against all of these things, you'd have to be taking hundreds or even thousands of pills. The reason they concentrate on iodine is because it has what's called a short half-life. It means that within 8 days, half of the atoms have disintegrated or disappeared and changed into something else, so that the threat is very, very shortly after the exposure. That's when you really get the dose to the thyroid gland. If you wait a year or so afterwards, most of that iodine-131 is going to be completely gone. Whereas with these other things, for example, you mentioned strontium, we've mentioned cesium-137, radioactive varieties of these materials, which don't exist in nature at all. The naturally occurring background of these materials is zero. They don't exist at all in nature. They're totally human-made. But if you wanted to protect yourself against those, they have a half-life of about 30 years. It means you'd have to be taking pills for the rest of your life, and you'd have to be giving them to your children and grandchildren, great-grandchildren as well. But they haven't even developed them. So we're talking here about pie in the sky. Many people falsely think of the iodine pills as being an anti-radiation pill. That's not what they are. They're simply protecting you, and especially children, and pregnant women especially, against the immediate effects of this radioactive material. Of that one
and also, I'd just like to add, unfortunately, politics comes into the situation. So in the Fukushima case, the government and the company of the day didn't want the public to panic, and so didn't tell them about the radio, about taking iodine, and didn't dispense it. Here in Canada now, you can get the iodine tablets from pharmacies or through the public health. And so we finally have got people to store these things and have them ready in case there is a disaster at Bruce, Pickering, or Darlington.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe Angela could say something about the efforts we've had to try and get these materials freely available to people that need them.
Mm-hmm. Angela?
Well, the activist community has been lobbying for years to get those iodine tablets distributed for free to nuclear communities. And just in the last couple of years, they were successful at forcing nuclear companies like Ontario Power Generation and Bruce Power to distribute for free the iodine tablets to all residents within 10 kilometers and to make them available for free to all residents within 50 kilometers. And the activist community has been lobbying to extend the distance at which they have to provide them proactively for free to the full 50 kilometers. But at this point, it's still only 10 kilometers. And now we're hoping that at the very least, they'll be distributing them to schools within the 50 kilometers.
Have they yet?
They haven't yet, but they have distributed within the 10 kilometers to all schools and all residents free proactively.
What they've done in the 50 kilometer zone is they've said that anybody who goes out of the way to request them can get them free, but they don't automatically deposit them in schools and so on. Now, of course, when you look at an accident like Chernobyl or Fukushima, you realize that these materials spread thousands of miles away from the source. But as you go further and further out, the concentration tends to diminish, although that can depend upon weather patterns. For example, in the case of Fukushima, there was one town called Itate, which was very heavily dosed with radioactivity simply because the wind shifted and blew that way, and the rain came and deposited the stuff. Rain is bad because it washes this material down. And even in the United States of America, there were some fairly heavy doses of iodine-131 in rainfall over certain states from Fukushima. So it's really a complicated situation, and you can't just draw a neat little circle and say that's the danger area. The environment is there forever when you talk about things which are of longer life.
I'd like to add, Metta, I'd like to add that residents of the GTA or residents within 50 kilometers of any nuclear facility in Ontario can order their free iodine pills at preparetobesafe.ca.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay. Now, I also have heard rumors, I don't know that it's more than that, that fish and other seafood, etc., from Fukushima have also been found on the west coast of North America. Is there anything to be worried about there?
Well, generally speaking, it is true that biological organisms, see, the thing is that these materials are basically the same as normal food. We eat food all the time. It goes into our body, and our body basically has a chemical factory inside called the stomach, which determines which materials are useful. And so it puts some materials in the meaty areas, it puts some materials in the blood, some in the brain, some in the bones. And it doesn't know, our body does not know what's radioactive and what's not radioactive. It hasn't been necessary until the invention of nuclear power and nuclear weapons. We didn't need to have a biological mechanism to distinguish between radioactive and non-radioactive. So our body doesn't know. And the fish are the same. So the fish basically, they reconcentrate material which has been scattered into the ocean or spewed into the ocean. The fish go and gather it up. If you had a fish tank, for example, and you sprinkle fish food on the top, okay, it's just lying there scattered on the top. The fish come and concentrate it. They gather it into their stomachs because that's food for them. And that's exactly what they do with radioactive materials as well. And this goes on for generations. So these materials tend to work their way up the food chain, and in some cases, they concentrate from one level to another. For instance, in up near Elliott Lake, they found that algae in the river, the Serpent River system, had levels of radium which were 100,000 times greater than the levels in the water. And that's because they were basically filtering out the radium as if it was good stuff, as if it was growing stuff they needed. And you know what a filter, like you take a vacuum bag out and that's a filter, right? It's just full of junk. Well, our bodies, in a sense, filter out certain materials from our food and from the air and from the water we drink, and they stay in the body. And that's what happens with all animals. And consequently, this material gets into the food chain, into the food we eat, as well as into our own bodies directly. A lot of the iodine that kids are exposed to, or adults are exposed to following a nuclear accident, are not just directly from inhaling the iodine, but from drinking the cow's milk. It turns out that when the iodine falls on the grass, the concentration in the grass is about 100 times greater than it was in the air. And then when the cows eat it, it's concentrated by another factor of 10 or 20 into the milk. And then when the kids drink the milk, it concentrates by another factor of 7 into the thyroid gland. So you have a concentration factor of thousands going from the air to the thyroid gland of a child.
Okay, now I've heard that from the nuclear tests of the 1950s, when they were doing them in the U.S., that some of the effects are still up there, coming down, over a period of many, many, many years. Of course, I suppose most of it happened during the time when Ursula Franklin was collecting baby teeth, but are we still getting even any amount into, for example, milk, the stuff that we consume today, from those sources?
Yes, we are. It's called, we have different types of radioactivity that we find in our environment. Some of it is naturally occurring. And those are, for example, the decay products of uranium, which is a naturally occurring radioactive material. But they tend to be at the heavy end of the spectrum. They don't tamper with most of the elements that are in our food as nutrients. We also have what's called Cosmo Genesis. There's cosmic radiation, which produces certain types of radioactive materials, which do come down to Earth, but in much lower concentrations than what we would get from bombs or from reactors. Then we have the leftovers, as you say, the fallout from bomb tests of the past. And yes, that material is still in the environment, and it's even still coming down. Plutonium, for example, which is scattered abroad during these atmospheric tests, has a 24,000-year half-life. And so that material will be coming down for thousands and thousands of years to come at a diminishing rate, but nevertheless, it's a constant insult to our ecosystem. Certain people, like Dr. John Goffman, who is both a medical doctor and a nuclear physicist, he said that plutonium is largely responsible for much of the increase in cancer that we've been seeing worldwide. So some of this atomic fallout from bomb programs, we tend to forget about it, but this has become part of our background. It's not natural, but it's there. And if we have serious accidents like Chernobyl and Fukushima, that adds again to our background. So when they talk about background radiation, quote unquote, it's a kind of a slippery slope, because if you're not cautious with this material, and if you're not lucky, that background radiation is going to go up significantly.
And this is, I think, my point is that military people, a lot of the physicists look at things as acute, and they look at it as localized. But when you have an accident, such as the Chernobyls, the Fukushimas, or an atomic blast, that these atomic radioactive materials go worldwide. They circulate around the world, and they persist for a long period of time. And I think that is a very important point that a lot of people fail to recognize.
Right.
Okay, well now when you get some of this stuff in the body, I don't know how worried to be. I had a dear friend who had some thyroid cancer or something, and she had radiation treatment. She was in a hospital for a week, and she came and stayed with me for a week before leaving town. And during the time she was with me, we were told not to touch each other. And she was supposed to do all kinds of precautions, like flush the toilet twice every time, and do various things with the eating utensils and all kinds of strange things, which I ignored because of her nonsense. That's silly. But then she left me, and her sister came and got her and took her down to Detroit. As they were crossing the bridge into the U.S., 70 miles an hour with the windows rolled up, When they got to the other side, the guy stopped them and said, "Who in this car has been taking radiation treatment?" They spotted her at that rate. Now, it made me really think, well, maybe these folks were right about saying she's dangerous to even be around. Tell me about that. Are we constantly surrounded by things that we should be worried about?
Well, that's a good example. Iodine happens to be a very strong emitter of gamma radiation, which is very penetrating and consequently very easy to measure. And so I had a friend who was a technician in the physics lab where I taught, and she found that after iodine therapy, such as you're talking about, they put iodine 131 into the thyroid gland in order to kill the malignant tumor. They do this not because iodine 131, radioactive iodine, not because it's healthy, but because it's deadly dangerous. And what they're doing is they're killing the tumor. They want to kill the tumor, and they know that radiation is deadly. So if they can get that iodine 131 into the cancer, they're hoping they can kill it without doing too much damage to the healthy cells. Now, but that is so radioactive that when she walked around the lab, she set off all the Geiger counters because gamma radiation is just streaming out of her body. And the reason why they were mentioning those precautions to you is because of that. Now, that will die down because fortunately iodine 131 has a relatively short half-life of 8 days. So after a matter of months, it'll be virtually gone. It'll still be a little bit left there, but not enough to be problematic. But certainly in the initial stages, it's a terrific dose of gamma radiation. Now, there are other materials. You've heard about the murder of Alexander Litvinenko in London, England, with a small amount of polonium-210. Mm-hmm. Now, polonium-210 is 250 billion times more toxic than cyanide. 250 billion times, according to Los Alamos Nuclear Laboratories. And yet it gives off no gamma radiation. It only gives off alpha radiation. And so when you have it in a glass vial, it will not trigger any alarms. You can smuggle it onto an airplane. You can smuggle it past border guards. It'll not trigger any alarms at all. However, once it's in the body, it's extremely dangerous. It's at least 18,000 times more toxic than iodine 131, for example. And so,
let me challenge you, because I wonder, as I recall that story, and I was following this Vanette thing with enormous curiosity. They said that they were able to trace the route that the assassins took. For the last week or so, they took a certain airplane to Germany someplace. They stayed in a hotel or something. Yeah. They could tell which plane they were on. Something must have been left behind. What was it that would have been left behind?
Well, in order to get it into the tea, you have to open the bottle. And when you open the bottle, then you can't control it because a tiny amount, the size of a small grain of sugar, would be enough to kill 1,000 people. And so you can leave traces like fingerprints, whatever, all where you're going. And they can be very minute amounts. But in order to detect them, you can't detect them using just a Geiger counter. You have to detect them using very special techniques because alpha rays are very difficult to detect. We had an incident here in Canada where over 500 workers were inhaling alpha-emitting dust at Bruce Nuclear Power Plant for 3 weeks, and nobody was able to detect it. And the reason why is because it only gives off alpha particles. And the alpha rays, the alpha particles, the alpha radiation is given off by these materials cannot be picked up easily by, usually what you have to do is you have to take a sample to the lab in order to determine that there's alpha radiation there. And yet, it's well known that alpha radiation is much more dangerous than any of the other forms. Less penetrating, but far more deadly.
Mm-hmm.
And and this is what I was saying with radon gas, is it's the #2 cause of cancer in Canada.
It's alpha
because
radiation.
it's an alpha emitter.
Okay.
The other point from a medical point of view is that, again, the difference between acute and also high dose, which is what's used in radiotherapy, is that kills cells, kills the cancer tumor cells. But the low dose chronic radioactive material that is emitting radiation, such as the alpha, is what actually causes cancer. So that's where you get the two differences between something that causes cancer, radioactivity, radiation, and the other radioactive therapy, which actually kills the cancer.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, an important factor here, which is medically understood by all involved, is that when you have a chronic exposure, a low exposure to healthy cells, this can trigger cancer indeed, but not every cell so exposed will become cancerous. There's only a small fraction that will become cancerous. And so your chances of not getting cancer are quite good, whereas your chances of getting cancer are there and real, but not very high usually. But the most important thing is that those cancers that are radiation induced do not manifest themselves as cancers for a period of at least 5 to 20 to 30 or 40 years after the exposure. So if your life is being threatened now by a cancer, better to kill the cancer, even at the risk of causing cancer 10 or 20 years later, because it buys you 10 to 20 years of life, even if you're unlucky to get cancer. And if you're lucky, you won't get it anyway.
Oh, that's useful information. You see why he's called the guru of the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility?
That's not my opinion, believe me.
But just a question, Gordon. Let's think of those Bruce nuclear workers who were exposed to alpha radiation recently. How can they prevent getting cancer in 30, 40 years?
They can't prevent it, unfortunately. My organization helped a man who assisted in a cleanup at Chalk River after a nuclear accident in 1952. He was a corporal in the Royal Canadian Air Force, and he was ordered to go there to help with the cleanup. And he had subsequently, decades later, he developed hundreds of highly unusual cancers all over his body. He had over 200 operations to remove cancers from every part of his body. And it was very, very difficult. We had 7 hearings before a pension review board before we finally had to go to the federal appeals court to get him a pension. But he did get a pension finally, a disability caused by service, because he was ordered as a military man to go there and clean up. Now, the trouble is that these diseases do not show up until decades later, and unless they're being carefully followed, and unless the nuclear establishment is willing to accept responsibility, they're out of luck.
And also, just sort of mention there, one of the very famous people that was involved in the cleanup of that accident was Jimmy Carter. And he was a military man. He was called in as part of that cleanup. And when he became president of the U.S., he made sure that there were no subsidies to the nuclear industry. Another Canadian example is, of course, Elliott Lake.
Jimmy Carter was at Chalk River cleaning up, or am I misunderstanding you?
Over you.
No problem. Another example, though, is Elliott Lake. And this is, again, I think, Metta, something, again, people need to understand, is how industry, governments set limits. So for you and me, background radiation is probably 1 to 3 millisieverts. And but for people that are working in nuclear power, they set the limits much higher. And maybe Angela and again Gordon can talk about those limits. But it was interesting when Bob Izumi bought up the houses that had been left in Elliott Lake after the uranium mine was shut down. To sell those homes, they had radiation emitting from them. And so they had to adjust and allow the background to be 20 millisieverts per year so that they could actually sell the houses.
Did they tell the purchasers what was happening?
Not here in Canada. In Florida, they had a similar problem because of radioactive mining there, phosphate ore in that case. But they have a law in Florida that whenever you sell a house in Florida, you have to give the radon readings for the house to the purchaser so that he knows what the radon levels in the house are. That's not a requirement in Canada. Unfortunately, in Canada, we've had a government which is the actual creator of the Canadian nuclear industry from day one. They're the ones who created the industry and who have supported the industry and who continue to support it. And the history here in Canada has been that they have been lax in their standards and also tended to deny the dangers. Whereas in other countries, they've been much more upfront in admitting, for example, the EPA, the US EPA, before Trump, admitted that that radon was a national public health hazard of top priority. That was never done in Canada until they were forced to do so by sheer embarrassment from other countries, all acting in that direction. I'd like to say something here which I think is useful to know. And that is, we've been talking a little bit about these acute doses of radiation. 600, we use these units, and I apologize for not defining them, but there's a unit an old unit called a REM, which is used in the United States, which is 100 times more as a unit than the unit which we use here internationally, which is the sievert. 600 REMs is equivalent to 6 sieverts, and that's the same dose. So if somebody is exposed to 600 REMs, if a population of people are exposed to 600 REMs or 6 sieverts of radiation, 95 to 100% of those people will die within a period of weeks due to massive radiation sickness. Their bodies are simply going to fall apart over a period of time. And now, it turns out that if you convert energy, any form of energy can be converted from one form to another. If you ask yourself, how much energy is that 6 sieverts? I did the mathematical calculation. It turns out it's enough energy, if it is expressed in calories, it's enough energy to raise 1 gram of water by 1/1000th of a degree Celsius. 1/1000th of a degree Celsius. And yet, it's a fatal dose of radiation to human beings. So how is that possible? The reason why is because the radiation attacks the living cells, and the damage that's done by the radiation is magnified by biological reproduction. The cells reproduce themselves and spread that damage throughout the body or throughout the lung or throughout the organ or whatever. And so it's the fact that radiation affects the very molecular basis of life itself that makes it so extremely effective in harming people. Now, I mentioned that a fatal dose of radiation would only raise the temperature of 1 gram of water by 1/1000th of a degree Celsius. The heat from the core of a nuclear reactor, which is completely shut down, is enough to melt the core of a nuclear reactor at a temperature of about 2800 degrees Celsius. So you can imagine how many fatal doses of radiation there are in there. And if that stuff were to be dispersed completely, because fortunately when we've had accidents, only a fraction has been released. If a nuclear weapon, for example, if a nuclear bomb were to explode on a nuclear reactor and spill the contents out over the environment, you would have many, many hundreds of thousands or millions of people who would receive immediately fatal doses of radiation, as well as the long-term effects that we've been talking about. So while fortunately our technology has so far prevented really massive releases of these radioactive materials at a immediately deadly level, if we were to have, for example, well, it was mentioned by, in 1976, there was a report from Britain called the Flowers Report. It said that, you know, if nuclear power plants had been developed before World War II, then as a result of World War II, large parts of Europe would be uninhabitable today because of the radioactive dispersal of these materials. They would be targets in warfare. And that's one of the best arguments against having nuclear power, because unless we have a completely peaceful planet that has done away with war and done away with armed conflicts, you shouldn't have these things around. Yep. They're going to lose their imprint for thousands of years to come.
Okay, well now I think we need to talk about what are the actual outcomes of the two most catastrophic nuclear accidents so far, Chernobyl and Fukushima. And the estimates about that vary all over the map. Everything from, I've heard people say only like 20 people died or something. And I've heard other people, there's one book that claims 1 million people already. So it's completely incoherent, the theories or the explanations. But then I believe people are saying that nobody has really died from Fukushima. Okay, maybe, I don't know. And I'd like all of your opinions about what the evidence shows. And I think that, Angela, didn't you say that you have some sort of report about the health effects of the Fukushima accident? If so, maybe you want to lead off with that, and then let's just generally reflect on the whole question.
Okay, I'm not going to respond to your question about the health effects of Fukushima and Chernobyl. What I'd like to address is bring the whole issue back to Ontario and talk about the Ontario situation. So maybe if Gordon or Richard want to talk about the health effects of Chernobyl and Fukushima, and then I'll bring it down to Ontario. Okay?
All right. Okay. Richard or Gordon?
Well, one thing that I should point out is that when you hear people talk about a couple of dozen, a few dozen deaths, they're talking about immediate acute deaths due to the so-called liquidators, the people who are actually shoveling the radioactive debris off the roof and who came in direct contact with very high fields of radiation and had that acute exposure that Richard was talking about. When you read the New York Academy report about the 1 million deaths, those are latent deaths, which are much later, cancer deaths, increases in cancer deaths of all kinds caused by the so-called latency period being decades. So over a period of decades. Well, I'll give you another example. At Chernobyl, even though there were few children who were directly killed by radiation, there were over 5,000 children in Belarus who had to have their thyroid glands surgically removed and who suffered medical consequences from thyroid disorders caused by the radioactivity that fell on Belarus from the Chernobyl accident. So the medical effects vary in time, they vary in severity. These children generally didn't die, but they'll be on medication for the rest of their lives. Their lives have been seriously altered for the rest of their lives. Death is not necessarily the worst thing. To me, the worst thing about nuclear power accidents, you can have accidents that are far worse in terms of immediate deaths. For example, the Halifax explosion, which killed 2,000 people or so, one blast. But the difficulty with radioactive accidents of that scale is that you have made a wasteland. You've made an uninhabitable area which will not be habitable for centuries to come. Around Chernobyl, you have centuries to wait before that land can be re-inhabited safely again. So it's really the poisoning of the ecosystem and the fact that you can't just move on with life as usual after such an accident. And as I said earlier, once the stuff is out into the environment, it's there for good.
And again, I'll just go to a principle. You know, when you look at risk, I think there's two components that. One is the frequency. And so with a Chernobyl, Fukushima, you're looking at 10 to 20 years, what we have seen now with 3 Mile Island as well. So it's not that often, granted. And a lot of people will say, hey, nuclear power is safe. But on the other hand, the enormity of the problem when it arises is tremendous. As Dr. Edwards has just said, it persists for a long period of time. It includes a huge area. So the Halifax affected a couple of streets from the harbor, but with the nuclear, with the Chernobyl, Fukushima, the radiation traveled up into Scandinavia, up through Germany, through France, all as well as Belarus, the closer areas. So that is another concept that I think people fail to take into account. When you're looking at Fukushima right now, they have still not been able to stop the leak of radiation into the ocean. And so again, you have an acute an effect, the meltdown out of 3 out of the 4 reactors there, but there's a continuous release of radioactive particles into the ocean, spreading that radiation, and that continues to this day. So that is another concept that people seem to fail to acknowledge.
Mm-hmm. I might also mention that the reason why we haven't had more accidents is because the nuclear industry has not been entirely successful. That really the nuclear power plants around the world, even though there's over 400 of them, they represent less than 2% of total global energy use. Mm-hmm. If you really try to displace oil with nuclear power, if you really tried to displace fossil fuels with nuclear power, you'd have to have tens of thousands of nuclear reactors built in relatively short order. And the result is that these accidents would increase. Alvin Weinberg, a nuclear physicist from Oak Ridge, said back in 1978 that and this is almost a direct quote, we nuclear scientists have not faced up to the consequences of complete success. If we built 10,000 nuclear reactors worldwide, we would expect to have a meltdown once every 4 years. So when you think about that, then you realize that that this is a kind of a dead-end technology. It's not a technology that we want to multiply, because when you multiply the technology, you also multiply the frequency with which these types of accidents are going to happen. And the consequences remain for a very long time after the incident that caused them. And in many cases, for example, in Toronto, we have nuclear reactors that are so close to the city of Toronto, to the heart of Toronto, that not only, if you had a Fukushima-style accident at Pickering, for example, not only would you have to evacuate all of Toronto, but you'd also contaminate the Great Lakes, particularly Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence River, with an enormous amount of radioactivity. The stuff that's going into the Pacific Ocean now from Fukushima, and at the time, would be going right into Lake Ontario. And Lake Ontario could not bear it. We have 40 million people drawing their drinking water from that. So one has to use one's imagination to realize, to face up, as Dr. Alvin Weinberg said, we have to face up to the consequences of complete success of the nuclear enterprise.
Mm-hmm. Maybe this would be a good time for me to bring it to the Ontario situation. Is that okay, Metta?
Please do, Angela, absolutely.
Yes. So, I mean, Gordon addressed the issue of the Pickering nuclear station right in the heart of the Greater Toronto Area. In fact, Ontario is the second largest nuclear jurisdiction in the world. We have 18 working nuclear reactors and several more that have already been shut down. Enormous amounts of potential danger. We really need to consider whether, is this worth rebuilding our entire nuclear arsenal? Because in fact, all of our nuclear reactors in Ontario are very old. And the province is considering how to, when we shut all our reactors down, they're all scheduled to shut down within the next decade. Should we rebuild them and extend the life of the existing reactors, or should we move to a renewable future? And we know that the world is really now moving renewable. The climate change crisis that we're facing demands that we move renewable. It's much cheaper now to go renewable. Even in Ontario, wind and solar are lower cost and water power are lower cost than rebuilding our aging nuclear reactors.
Sorry,
it really makes...
I don't want to interrupt you too much, Angela, but does that include the cost of storage? Because I've been having an ongoing argument with a guy who says, yes, you can get solar power and wind power now pretty cheap, but you can't store it unless you pay a lot.
Well, the beautiful thing about Ontario is we live next door to Quebec, which is the 4th largest water power producer in the world. Quebec has massive surplus power, and their large dams act as a battery storage, essentially. So when the wind's not blowing, we let the water flow. When the wind's blowing, we store up the energy in the reservoirs. So in fact, Water power from Quebec could replace most of Ontario's nuclear power at a fraction of the cost. Quebec has been offering it at a very low, at a third the price. Water power is, they are offering it to us at a third the price of us rebuilding the Darlington nuclear station. And essentially half the price of us even extending the Pickering nuclear station. So it is much lower cost. Wind and solar is coming down all around the world. You know, we really don't have to rebuild our aging nuclear infrastructure, especially since it's in the middle of Canada's largest urban population. Why would we risk a catastrophic accident at Pickering or Darlington surrounded by millions of people? You know, we're economists. We're looking at the various prices of our energy options. And I'm addressing right now how much lower cost wind, solar, and water are than nuclear power. But we have hired scientists to look at the risks, both the financial and the health risks of accidents that could potentially, you know, what would be the risk of an accident at the Pickering nuclear station, for example. And we looked at what would happen if we had a Pickering or a Fukushima-size accident, if it was that big, and if the winds were blowing in the same direction and the fallout patterns were the same as Fukushima. If that happened at Pickering, we hired Dr. Ian Fairley, a radiation biologist from the UK. And essentially 154,000 homes would be evacuated for 100 years. All of Pickering would be evacuated, much of Toronto. The financial consequences of just the housing losses alone are $125 billion. You know, he estimated there would be 26,000 cancers, half of which would be fatal, and on and on and on. Why would we risk that? When we have lower cost renewable alternatives, the world is moving renewable. It just makes no sense. Also, Dr. Ian Fairley did a report about tritium, and as Dr. Denton was mentioning, the ongoing radiation risks of just low dose radiation releases. And the Pickering nuclear station alone, with its 6 working nuclear reactors, releases 100 kilograms of tritiated water vapor every day into the air and into the water. And by his estimates, he says we shouldn't be eating the food within 5 kilometers of the Pickering nuclear station, food in gardens or trees, apple trees, and that women shouldn't get pregnant within 10 kilometers of the Pickering nuclear station. So these are real risks that we're calling for the closure of the Pickering nuclear station and replacement with water power, other renewable energy technologies, which are now lower cost and much safer.
Let me just add to what Anta has said, which is very, very important, of course. Just to cut through the jargon a little bit, tritiated water is just a fancy word for radioactive water. Water is not radioactive normally, but radioactive water is radioactive, and because of a substance called tritium, which is radioactive hydrogen. Everyone knows that water is H2O. When the hydrogen becomes radioactive, you have radioactive water. Now, the worst thing about radioactive water is that you can't filter it out of your water system because you can't filter water from water. There's no way that any municipal or domestic water cleansing system can remove the tritium from your water. So it goes right into our bodies and into the bodies of our children. The levels of tritium in Lake Ontario are from 2 to 3 times greater in the center of Lake Ontario than they are in Lake Superior. And that's entirely due to our nuclear reactors. So we have to realize that we are really setting this material out in large amounts, and it's coming out in the form of water vapor. It's coming out, and because water is one of the basic building blocks of life, every living material, including all the food we eat and all the beverages we drink, is going to have that tritium in it, aplenty. So this is really one example, and that's just only one of the substances we're talking about. But it's one example of why we have to really think about what do we mean by a sustainable future and a healthy future. And it doesn't seem like we're going in the right direction when we realize that the amount that we've allowed to escape so far is considered good management. What happens when you have bad management? When you have a bad day and things really go south, then you have a huge influx of these materials of all kinds. So I'd just like to mention one other point that we haven't even mentioned in this, and I'll say that the reason I first got involved in this whole question of nuclear reactors and uranium and so on is not because of any of the things we've talked about, but because of the question of proliferation of nuclear weapons. It turns out that every nuclear power plant, such as the Pickering plant, such as the Darlington plant, every single nuclear reactor producing electricity in the world today is also producing a man-made, a human-made material called plutonium. And plutonium is a...
Uh-oh, we've got a glitch here.
Nuclear power plants. We are spreading the capability of building nuclear weapons. That's a whole other question, but it's one that I think just puts the exclamation point behind everything else we've said regarding radiation.
Absolutely. That's how I got interested.
Another byproduct is the after nuclear power, you have depleted uranium. Mm-hmm. Now, it's not actually depleted. You still have uranium there, but it's a very heavy substance and is used by us to shoot for the bunker busting bombs and the anti-tank bombs. And then once you destroy a tank after the war, you have little children playing in these tanks that now are emanating radiation. Mm-hmm. And so one of the theories is that that may be part of the Gulf War syndrome. Mm-hmm. So again, radiation becomes ubiquitous.
Yeah. Oh boy. Well, look, there's only one last issue that I think we must touch upon, and that is, of course, the support for nuclear power these days is mostly animated by desire to reduce global warming, and the theory is that, of course, that nuclear power plants are less, they do not give out greenhouse gases. Well, so the people like, I think this guy Jensen and many others argue that the new Generation 4 nuclear reactors are much safer. I don't know what they are all about, but I do know that we in Peace Magazine have just published an article by Brené Lloyd, whom I think all of you know, who has written about having attended some sort of conference in Ottawa where they were promoting small modular reactors to be set up in local neighborhoods. And they don't even need to be attended because they are so safe. Please give me your thoughts about that. How much safer would any of these new modernized or updated forms of nuclear power plants be?
Well, shall I talk about that?
Sure, go ahead.
A reactor is a reactor. What a reactor is a device for splitting uranium atoms. When you split uranium atoms, you create hundreds of broken pieces of broken uranium atoms, and that's what the things that we've been talking about. Strontium-90 is a broken piece of uranium. Cesium-137 is a broken piece of uranium. Iodine-131 is a broken piece of uranium. And the reason why these are so unstable and therefore so radioactive is because they have been achieved violently by breaking apart a large atom, the uranium atom, and they're highly unstable, and that's what radioactivity is. That means that each little atom that is the fragment of a uranium atom is like a little time bomb, and it's going to emit this kind of subatomic shrapnel, which causes all this damage. Now that happens whether the reactor is small or large, no matter how you cool the reactor, no matter what the size or shape of the reactor is, the same thing happens. You get what's called high-level radioactive waste. You're going to get that no matter what. Now, what the government of Canada, unfortunately, I think all of us, are very happy that the planet is waking up to the dangers of global warming. And we are entirely of the idea of trying to deal with that problem. But nuclear is like the Pied Piper. It's not a solution. It's going to lead us off in the wrong direction. It's going to stampede us down the wrong path, which is a dead-end path. and it's much too slow. In Germany, they have phased out nuclear power. They're in the process of phasing it out. They had 17 nuclear reactors. They shut down 8 immediately after the Fukushima accident, and they're planning to have the rest of them shut down by the year 22, I believe. And in the meantime, they have invested heavily in solar and wind, and they built more wind power in 8 years. The amount of wind power that they installed in 8 years is 3 times greater than the entire nuclear installations in Canada. Imagine, in 8 years, you could not build that much nuclear power in 8 years. It would be impossible. Nuclear power is very slow, whereas the renewables can be deployed very quickly, and people forget that there is energy efficiency, which is even faster than renewables and gives you even greater returns. We did studies published here in Canada decades ago showing that we could phase out fossil fuels and nuclear and have a completely renewable society, meeting all of Canada's projected energy needs, even with increases in GDP that the government projected, increases in population that the government projected, increases in transportation that the government projected. We could meet all of those with renewable if we just concentrate on that. What's happened in the last 15 years is nuclear has taken a big slide. It's dropped from 17% of world energy electricity down to around 10%, and it's still going down. Whereas wind and solar has taken off like a house on fire, and storage of electricity, which is necessary for any electrical powered transportation sector, has also improved enormously. So we're very much on a winning track with renewables, efficiency, and storage even. These are all doing great, and they're progressing very rapidly. The trouble is that if you put your money into a nuclear plant, you're diverting that money away from what really makes sense, which is dealing with the problem now, getting the problem cut down now. And our government is planning to deploy, maybe in 10 or 20 years, thousands or hundreds at least of nuclear reactors, small ones, all over the north, all over where they have mines, where they have oil sands extraction, and also where they have old coal plants. They'll put a small modular reactor in them. This is leading us in the wrong direction because it doesn't really address the problem quickly enough, sustainably enough, and you still have the same old problems, radioactive waste, which doesn't go away.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
The other thing I'd just like to mention, Metta, is that, again, nuclear power people will say that it is a clean source. It doesn't contribute to global warming. When a nuclear power plant is up and running, that is correct. But they fail to look at what I was going to talk about, the nuclear fuel chain, which is the mining, the transportation, the refining, the enriching, not so much for CANDU reactors, but for other reactors. Then the building of these nuclear power plants, which are huge, and then the decommissioning eventually of these nuclear power plants. And then the going to have to find out a method to store them, which we still haven't done. So in all of these processes, you do have the emission of carbon dioxide. One of the big emitters of carbon dioxide is concrete. And that's what nuclear power plants are made out of. Mm-hmm. And, and the trouble is that once you have a nuclear power plant, the plant itself becomes contaminated with radiation. And so then there's a whole problem of dealing with that. And the Bruce, several years ago, was trying to ship radioactive steel to Sweden. And luckily we prevented that. But that's another problem. Mm-hmm. And again, I think Gordon and Angela can talk a bit more about all of that.
We're getting overtime, but it's one point. I don't want to stop from right away. I want to ask one final line of questioning though, which I know nothing about, except that there's a man I know I've met named Peter Ottensmeyer or something like that, a retired physicist at U of T, who has a bee in his bonnet. He really thinks that the important thing is there are ways of burning up and using the waste products that are dangerous, and reusing them as fuel or something of that kind. I don't understand the technology, and I just want your thoughts about it.
This is something that we've been dealing with at the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility. Way back in 1975, we wrote an open letter to Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau, calling attention to the fact that the government of Canada at that time was wanting to embark upon precisely this kind of program. They're called fast reactors, and they're using plutonium as a fuel, not just the uranium, and not just the one type of uranium which we currently use, which is uranium-235, but also the U-238. U-238 is the bulk of the uranium that you mine from the earth is uranium-238. Less than 1% is uranium-235. But what has always been a dream of the nuclear proponents is that if you start using all of the uranium by converting the U-238 to plutonium and then using plutonium as fuel, that you can extend the lifetime of the nuclear enterprise by thousands of years. And in a certain sense, you're using up some of the waste byproducts of the original plants because you're extracting the plutonium and reusing that. But this is all very misleading, because it turns out that the most dangerous things in the short term from nuclear power plants are not plutonium directly, but the byproducts, the fission products, the cesium, the strontium, the iodine, the various things that we've been talking about. And those are not diminished by using the type of reactor that Dr. Ottenmeier is talking about. In fact, they are increased. You would have to increase by 10-fold or 20-fold the amount of cesium, iodine, tritium, and so on, compared with the existing reactors. So it's a solution to the nuclear energy problem if all you're interested in is perpetuating nuclear power. Then it offers a kind of a hope. You say, hey, we could keep going for 1,000 years. True, but you would also be increasing the problems 1,000-fold or more. And the worst thing about it is that by using plutonium as a fuel, you put it into circulation in a way that criminals can get their hands on it. Anything that is circulated commercially falls into the hands of criminals. Heroin, money, diamonds, jewels, you name it. Anything that is circulated commercially, criminals are going to get their hands on it. If criminals get their hands on plutonium, which is being circulated as nuclear fuel, then you have any criminal organization can have its own nuclear weapons. This is a nightmarish possibility called the plutonium economy, and it's something that much has been written about. And I would not recommend it to anybody unless they have a death wish.
Well, I actually think of even worse than ordinary criminals, and that are suicide bomber terrorist kinds of people.
Exactly.
Who would like not only to destroy themselves, but take down as many human beings as they possibly can, and they can take down a hell of a lot of them that way. Well, I think sorry.
Many years ago, one of the advisors to the U.S. president said, we could wake up one morning and find Washington, D.C. gone and not even know who did it. But the danger is that once a nuclear explosion wipes out a capital or a large city like New York City or whatever, then it's only, there's a very real possibility that this could provoke an accidental nuclear war. Because if you think that the Russians did it, or if Pakistan thinks India did it, or whoever thinks whoever did it, then you start having all-out nuclear warfare, and it's game over for all of us. So this whole prospect is very nightmarish, and I'm afraid that Dr. Ottenmeier doesn't discuss those aspects of the problem well enough. However, it is thoroughly discussed in a report which I mentioned earlier called the Flowers Report, published back in 1976. And Dr. Flowers, who is also a nuclear physicist, argued, because he was talking precisely about the plutonium economy, he said that the whole of society should really think whether that's the path they want to go down. We have time to stop and think. We better do it now, because once we embark upon that path, there's no turning back.
Thank you, Gordon, and thank you, all of you. Richard, thank you, Angela. I can't thank you enough, and I think the world needs to thank you a lot more, too, because the kind of message that you're giving us is one that we absolutely need to hear. And I had to tip my hand at the beginning to say, I was pretty sure we were all on the same page. And if anything, I'm even more on the same page with you folks now than I was at the beginning. But all of you are involved with organizations that are doing extremely important work. Angela's Ontario Clean Air Alliance, Richard's work with the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. He's the co-chair of the North American facility, and of course Gordon Edwards with his amazingly erudite exposition of the realities about nuclear power and the risks thereof, and his work. He is the head of the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility. And I sit here in Toronto simply saying hello on behalf of other people who are participating in this thing called Project Save the World. And nuclear reactors and nuclear radiation dangers are one of the risks that we're trying to save the world from. So thank you, all my partners. And I wish we could talk another hour or so, but I think we'd lose our audience unless we quit off at some point. Thank you again. Okay.
Thank you very much, Metta.
Thanks, Metta.
Thank you very much, Metta.
Bye.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Bye.
Peace.